My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, the most evil pyramid scheme since... Oh, I'm sorry. Legal is telling me I can't name any specific MLM company. It's the Death Ziggurat.
Our first segment is a basic crawl. The Death Ziggurat is an 11-page cosmic necro crawl for Mörkborg. It was written by Carl Niblius with editing, graphic design, and art by Johan Nohr. Find the Ziggurat and stop the demon from laying waste to our world before the true time. So goes the orders from the group of monks who have hired the player characters to go to a massive crater in the cold, desolate woods of Sarkash and destroy the demon goddess they find there. Along the way, they may encounter the demon's rock priests, a group of fanatical death cultists, a blood-sucking misery known as Sarku, loads of undead, ice lilies, a spiral chapel, a giant rotting mouth, and much more.
The module begins with a description of the woods of Sarkash and the things that can be found before entering the crater, or depression, as the module calls it, including the aforementioned death cultists. From there, we get a lovely labelled map of the depression, and then a few pages of descriptions of the things that can be found there, including evidence of the world-ending magic the demon Akun and her followers are invoking, the Spiral Chapel, which houses a powerful relic that can be used to stop the magic, and some details about the eponymous Death Ziggurat, which actually exists in a different dimension, the Death Realm. This section also includes some tables for random encounters within the ruins that can be found in the depression. After that, we have a section with stat blocks for various monsters and NPCs, and then the module ends with an unlabeled version of the map to be given to the players.
Let's talk about our bona fides here. How have we used this?
I have mainly only read it, although I was in a 4-session Mörkborg adventure that sort of drew on some of the elements of this, but not in sufficiently one-to-one away for me to really be able to tell what came from where, to be honest. How about you?
I ran this as a 2-shot using trophy gold. Things we liked about the Death Ziggurat. I think we should probably just get some basic stuff out of the way. For me, I think you can't go wrong with the artwork and the graphic design of this dungeon. Mm-hmm. I think everyone knows at this point that Mörkborg is really doing something very special with graphic design and layout and artwork. It's just got this very textured, very heavy metal feel. Lots of yellow in these products.
Yeah, black with yellow accents, yeah.
It's really, really good here. It looks great. Even though it's a very short module, it actually is just packed with stuff. It kind of really punches above its weight in terms of module length to artwork.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think in this, the year of our Lord 2021, nobody needs to be told about how Mörkborg looks, but podcasts stick around. So if you're listening to this in 10 years' time, Mörkborg was, I don't think it's exaggerating to say it caused a minor sensation with just the way it had a real kind of, we don't care about what you think attitude to graphic design,
right,
and layout and stuff.
And it has since been copied a lot by people, even in the short amount of time it's been around.
So. I know, it's only it's not been that long, has it? It just feels like it's, and I think that's one of the things that's so great about it, and also that applies to this module as well, is it is something that's quite different, and yet it feels very familiar, I guess because it's sort of drawing on these things that are in the periphery of fantasy gaming, doom and black metal aesthetics, all these names like the Forest of Sarkash and so on. And it's all very rip-offable as well. So I was in an adventure that used elements from it. Any of these random tables that we're going to come to later, you could take that. The artwork similarly draws on these kind of... it's not copying anything particularly, but it certainly feels... It evokes predictable reactions in people that do fantasy gaming, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't we go to more substantive things? Just the adventure itself, the vibe, the mood, the feeling. Tom, what do you got?
Well, I like how it starts with a good solid hook right there in the very first line. Go kill this demon, which is one of the problems sometimes with a little mini sandbox like this. It's from memory, I'm going to say something like 8 by 12 hexes, not that many.
It's pretty small, yeah.
Yeah, but it can be aimless, right? There are landmarks. Oh, should we go and look at that tower in the distance? Here you've got a mission, which is straightforward, but it means if you are just poking around, you're poking around with a purpose, which is great. I also like that the mission is much like we've commended Dungeon Crawl Classics for getting you straight into the going up against Chaos Lords at level 1. This is the same. This, by the way, is the free sample adventure on the Merkborg website. Okay, this is this is the equivalent of killing rats in the basement. It's going into a depression and tangling with death cultists. So, 10 out of 10 there. I think it's fantastic.
This is a big, powerful, apocalyptic event. This is a big thing that these characters are dealing with.
Yeah, I think these 4 ragtag schmoes could deal with it. You mentioned cool encounters. One thing that caught my eye and that I really like is that the main NPCs are right there in your random encounter tables when you're just doing your poking about between hexes. 10 times out of 12, something's going to happen when you move to a new hex. And I think 4 times out of a D12 roll, that's going to be either the demon, is it Arkun? I've already forgotten.
Arkun.
Or the sort of former advisor character.
Oh, Sarkun.
Yeah, Sarkun.
I love that part too. I'll tell you, in play, the players were delighted that Dread Arkun, this demon that they came to destroy and that they've been kind of hearing about, especially from other characters, they were delighted that Arkun just showed up in a scene.
Yeah.
Like, she was just there suddenly. The way I set it up, it was a little bit more dramatic than just, she's just there, like, tending to the undead or whatever. But nevertheless, I was kind of playing off the random encounter table a little bit. I think that this module has a lot of really fantastic set pieces. The Ziggurat, before you get to the sort of Death Realm version of it, there's just a pit in the ground where the Ziggurat would be, and the pit is described as being filled with essentially thousands of zombies just crawling atop one another. And it's just a wonderful, striking, ghoulish, horrifying vision, and it comes out great in play. Once you do get to the Death Realm, this necropolis that you have to wade through, you have to kind of get through, and it's surrounded by this fetid pool. It has just this very like dramatic framing to it. It's just a lot of fun. The frozen lake that's covered with these black ice lilies. The chapel, which is like the lone standing building in these ruins. It's just very striking and beautiful. The weird fucking mouth in the cave.
Oh, the mouth.
There's like a big giant rotting mouth. It's like the cave door. It's just kind of these like set pieces that are just meant to be really metal, right? And just be really cool and like to delight the players. And I kind of love that.
Yeah, I mean, that mouth in particular, well, it's sort of, I think it's of a piece with some of the random treasures you find as well, which all are, the minor ones are all worth 3d10 silver or whatever, but they're all physically different. Like you could find an iron mask, a vampire mask or something is one I remember. And so that, and the reason I'm going to tie this back to that weird mouth in a cave in a second, is they all, in terms of collecting treasure, they don't really do anything. But they all suggest like new possibilities for ways to interact with the world. You show up in front of the rot priests as yourself, that's one thing. Show up wearing an iron vampire mask, maybe you'll make a different impression.
Yeah.
I think that mouth in the cave is so weird and brilliant as well. Like, it doesn't seem to do anything, right? If I'm remembering this correctly, you have to go down through some undead-filled caves, and eventually you get to this mouth, and if you pour blood on it, it will open, and then you can come out of the forest near the camp of some cultists. So that seems like it's a shortcut between 2 places you don't want to go. But if you were, I don't know, let's say wearing an iron vampire mask and walked out of that mouth towards the camp of death cultists with the correct demeanour, that might be a bunch of people you could suddenly win over with your impressiveness.
Yes, absolutely.
It's all these little things that are lying around that are ready to be... They don't have a prescribed purpose, except for the spiral crown, maybe, which we'll get to. That's kind of more of a big deal plot device. But yeah, just these little bits of just interesting enough for someone to be inventive with. Like, there's no obvious right answer, which is great.
Well, and here's something else that I like about the module, and this is actually really specific to Trophy Gold or maybe like World of Dungeons, just any kind of like light fake-ass OSR system. The Death Ziggurat was a great module to convert because it is not as concerned with stat blocks and details as much as it is concerned with moments. Like you said, it's concerned with like just putting objects in the environment and seeing what you do with them. It's concerned with these set pieces. It's concerned with a particular vibe. It has very strong thematic elements. Because that is the way that it's written and the emphasis is not on details and stats, it made it a particularly easy and pleasurable dungeon to convert to these lighter systems, these more narrative systems that I prefer. That was a big A+ for me.
For sure. I mean, I think that one of the things with Merkborg is that though it's stats light, those stats don't map very well to other systems. So if you're going to use it, you have to be using materials that don't require that kind of thing. But I mean, yeah, even the spiral crown, which is maybe the most prescriptive treasure. Well, to explain it, it's a MacGuffin because it will help you out. It's also a trap and maybe a treasure if you took it out as well, which I like about it. It's in the chapel. You got to find the lock that hides it and the key. Basically, if you put this thing on, you've got 3 your choice of save rolls, like before it sends you crazy and your character dies. But every turn you've got it on, you're doing damage to the villain. So in theory, you could just kill her by wearing this hat, although you'd go through at least 2 PCs, I think, to do so.
Well, I think she shows up at some point, too.
And that's the thing. She'll show up, so presumably your buddies are fighting her off while you're dying in a crown, which is maybe not the way you want to solve this problem, right. But in theory, you never need to go to the Ziggurat, which I think is great. It's one of those things where, with a bit of luck and ingenuity, you can find a way that makes life a bit easier for you. But this being Mörkborg and kind of pretty grimdark, it's not...
It has a cost, right? Yeah, there's a cost to it. Yeah.
And of course, you could end up just putting it on. You could kill yourself in that chapel and never figure out what's going on. You could TPK, get yourself struck by lightning, put the crown on, blow your mind, and not get anywhere near your goal. So
other things that we liked about this is maybe perhaps more of a thematic thing, but the module does a really good job of bouncing between ideas of sort of stark frozen beauty and horror, and I really like that. Other things that I like about the module, we've already kind of touched on it, but some very, very fun NPCs to play. Sarku, super, super fun, like to roleplay. I was particularly happy with my characterization of Sarku, and I feel like that was inspired a lot by the text. The rot priests are just so vile and disgusting and just ghoulish, just straight up ghoulish, and they're just really, really fun to get out there because they're these ghoulish characters, but they're yammering on with each other about philosophy and the death realm and stuff like that. But they're these characters who are having these philosophical debates, but they're covered in black veils and they have disgusting giant mouths in their chests, right? And they eat human body parts. It's just this neat blending of elements, which is really, really fun to play.
Yeah, it's terrific. And also I noted that there's these, I don't think they're called zombies in the text, but they're essentially, you're shambling undead. I really like these for, weirdly, a mechanical reason, but doesn't involve mechanics. You just read it. You don't need to know the system, which is that they genuinely don't die. You kill them, they stay dead for a round, they come back with 1 hit point. Fine. But it also says, and I'll quote from the text, slow can always be outrun unless you've been grappled. I mean, that's just such an easy way to think about it. And yet, somehow not enough zombie-based adventures and games seem to figure out that's just what you say. You can always run away from them, except when you can't. That's kind of it. They keep coming back. Done. So,
exactly.
It's wonderful. And like you mentioned the NPCs, I do like that, especially I'm really into the idea of Sarku, this sort of disaffected Grand Vizier figure of the baddie.
Yeah, it's classic. Very cool. Yeah, it's a classic setup. So listeners, in case you haven't read it, Sarku is this this is a golem type creature. He was this sort of counselor to Akun in the before times, but then when he realized that Akun was this world-ending demon, he betrayed her, he left her, and she essentially kind of cursed him to be this blood-sucking vampiric golem type wretched creature that can't leave. And so Sarku wants revenge on Akun. And so you can treat with Sarku to figure this stuff out about Akun, but Sarku is just so vile and a wretched character. It's great fun. The last little thing I'll say that I liked about this, it's very well sized for a 2-shot. I don't think we often get 2-shot sized dungeons. Things are either really short or much longer, it seems like. And so this felt just really comfortable 2-shot, and I was happy with that.
Nice.
Anything else you want to say about it?
No, I think let's move on to questions, I think.
Go for it.
Talking a bit about Sarku, he seems like the biggest candidate for this. Am I right in thinking the talkative NPCs are quite useful to run this? And I'm thinking the kind of dogs in the vineyard kind of NPC where you ride into town and they're like, hey, are you here to pass judgment on the saloon owner? And in a similar way, I think you need someone to, after you visited the Ziggurat and there was just a pit of dead bodies, you kind of need someone to either tell you or show you unwittingly that you need a medallion of the rot priests to get into it, right?
It does. I'm not 100% sure, in a more traditional game at least, how the players would figure out what they're supposed to be doing if there were not talkative NPCs, meaning not talkative listener as in jabbering on at the mouth or whatever, but talkative in the sense of like they're giving up information.
Yeah.
Like they want to tell you things. They have things to tell you. I say in a more traditional game, I think it would be harder because in Trophy Gold, in fact, the players know what they're supposed to be doing because of the set goals, right? So this is not an issue in Trophy Gold. But nevertheless, I still sort of revealed things in this way. Like Sarku told my group about how to destroy Akun in the Ziggurat. Spoiler alert, there's a heart. Her heart is beneath the Ziggurat.
It's super easy once you've got there.
Yeah, once you know it, it's like super simple. It's like the easiest encounter. But if you don't know that, you're going to get destroyed because you don't know what to do. Same thing with getting to the Death Realm in the first place. Like, you have to figure out that these amulets lead to the Death Realm. And I think it didn't play out this way. The way my group did it is they just essentially kidnapped one of the rot priests and forced them to give up the information. Right?
Yeah, I mean...
But I could totally see a situation, the way I was ready to play it, was the rot priests are sitting around the campfire having a philosophical discussion, and if the players just paid attention long enough, they would learn that, like, the rot priests are able to walk into the Death Realm because of these amulets they wear. Also, that sort of idea of the amulets being a key to the Death Realm, that's hinted at a little bit in the introduction to the module that you read to the players as well. So there's a little bit of that. But the death cultists that are kind of camped outside of the Depression, their whole purpose, like, I don't think you can really learn their purpose unless you go chat with them in some way.
Yeah.
NPCs that are willing to give up information is probably pretty important here.
Yeah, and actually, speaking of those cultists, did you get much out of that whole Weird Mouth in a Cave and Death Cultist Camp section? It seems interesting, but I don't know, peripheral.
I'm glad you asked this question. I saw it on the notes, and I'm glad you asked it, because here's the thing about this rotting mouth. Just to make this a really clear picture for you listeners, it's a big mouth, a literal mouth, not a cave mouth, a mouth, like with teeth and tongues and lips, that is in a hill face. And if you spill blood on it, it opens up. You can do it from either side. You can do it from the interior, like from because basically the cave like connects from the inside the depression to back out to the surface, right? Yeah. It's a way of easily getting back to the surface. Or you can go the other way, I suppose, right? If you found the mouth first, I suppose you could like enter the depression through the cave by going through the mouth. The thing is, though, especially if you start in the depression and work your way back up to the surface where the mouth is, the mouth doesn't do much.
Yeah, and it's a real
It's
hassle.
just the entrance. It's a door.
Yeah.
And even the cultists who are kind of camped out near the mouth, they don't do much in the story. They're almost more just like flavor. Like they're just drawn to the dark energy of this place. They don't even know what they're doing. Kind of like what you said earlier, Tom, about depending on how the player characters exit the mouth back up to the surface, that will be received a certain way because of the moment of like emerging from a giant mouth in the ground. And the way they did it is they pretended to be like demon servants of Akun, like coming out of the mouth, right? And so
I think that's got to be your play, surely,
yeah,
most of the time.
And so it terrified this like kind of low-level, goofy cultist, and he's like, flailing around and stuff. And it was a funny moment. I liked it. But yeah, it doesn't serve much purpose.
Yeah, that's fair.
Let's go to the Chain Lightning round. Tom kicks off.
Okay. The opening line of the adventure. Find the Ziggurat and stop the demon from laying waste to our world. Before the true time. See, a lot of people would have said just stop it. But not the monks who hired your PCs.
Indeed. There is a time that the world will end. Just not this one. The water lilies that can be found on the frozen lake can be powdered and presumably inhaled or ingested in some way, causing any number of interesting magical effects. I especially like this one. All the hair on your body turns white, your skin the color of a bog mummy.
The demon Akun can teleport freely within the depression, and this happens in the following manner. A rotting mouth eats its way out of the ground, and she climbs out.
The picture of the Ziggurat on page 7 is dramatic and very badass.
The horn beasts are described as, and Lowell Francis and anyone else with a teeth thing, stop listening now, a chaotic mass of horns and bones with a circular mouth filled with teeth instead of a face. They rip enemies apart with their sharp claws.
And finally, this description of Sarku, a gaunt, ghastly form with a long, sharp tongue that sucks the blood of his victims and stretches their tongues. The dried-up corpses hang upside down from the trees. He wants to be set free of his earthly prison and move on to the afterlife. He knows where Akun's heart is, and that stabbing it kills her. Let's go to the expert delve. It's the expert delve. Listeners, you may recall, longtime listeners at least, you may recall that when we covered the Fever Swamp adventure, Tom and I talked about running games in a swampy environment and different considerations you might want to make, whether running games in that environment or creating modules that are set in environments like that. It was a series that we had sort of planned, and now finally we are here in part 2 of that series talking about frozen wastes and frozen environments, Arctic tundra type environments. I think, Tom, that at the outset we should just talk a little generally about like our thoughts on running adventures in environments like this, in these frozen cold environments. But also I would kind of like to from there move on to mechanical considerations, performative aspects, thematic concerns, things like that. Sound good?
Yeah, that sounds great. What's your first general thought then about the frozen north?
Well, one thing that I'll point out, there's a big difference between environments that are cold, maybe even very cold, and environments that are like deeply, bitterly, miserably cold. It's a big, big difference in terms of how you experience it. And I don't have a huge amount of personal experience with this, but I did live for a blessedly short period of time in the Great Lakes region of Illinois when I was in the Navy for about, 6 or 7 months. It was in the late fall and winter. I can't recall the last time I've lived in a place so miserable and horrible. Like, I hated every minute of it. And it's because the level of cold every day being outside in that environment, it was like Mother Nature saying, your kind don't belong here. Right? Like it just constantly hostile. The ground has ice so thick that no one even bothers to try to clear it, and you're just sliding around everywhere. No matter how much you layer up, you're always just deeply, deeply cold. Your breath is always short. Your hands and your face are always dry and red and bleeding. It's bad. I'm particularly not fond of the cold, and so for me, this was just like so horrible. I am not convinced that as a species, we were ever meant to be in such places. I think it's an accident that human beings ended up in such places, but nevertheless, we're there, right, in different ways. And so to me, I think that like the best thing you can do, generally speaking, is to convey this sense of misery, but also, on the flip side of that, and alluding to a little bit what I said earlier, there is a beauty to it, to these environments, right? It's a stark beauty. It's an empty beauty, but it's a beauty. It's the same kind of beauty that I love in, like, say, the American Southwest, like in New Mexico and places like that. It's a similar kind of beauty. Those two big ideas of a miserable, hostile environment that wants to kill you always, and this sort of stark beauty, I think those are the two big general senses and ideas you want to capture.
Yeah, I think that's fair. My being cold credentials are, I lived in Beijing for a time, which in winter is reasonably harsh. I also had a short, but for me, very memorable trip to Harbin in Heilongjiang province near the border with Russia for the ice festival. It gets a little chilly, but it's also a beach resort in the summer. Strange place. I think, especially from my experience of living in Beijing when it was snowing, you're right. There is I think, especially on the beauty side, when it's actually a nice day or there's been snowfall, and when you're prepared, like when everything's going right, it's actually very satisfying to be out and about in the cold, even quite severe cold. As long as your gloves are dry, you put on all your layers of clothing. There's a sort of sensation, a bit like like when you're inside a tent that isn't leaking and it's raining outside. There's sort of like kind of slight smugness, and you get the same kind of thing, wearing a lovely winter coat as the wind blows against you, and you can feel it's sort of blowing, but you don't feel cold. And of course that immediately goes wrong when you discover you've got a hole in your shoe and you step in a freezing cold puddle,
right,
or you start to get wet, or you miss it, you're not wearing enough clothes. And also I think the idea of modified behavior, so of course people who live in the cold environments all the time, for example, maybe First Nations in Canada, or the Sami in Finland and in the north of Sweden and Norway and Russia. I'm not saying they have an easy time of it, but like their lifestyle is relatively accustomed to that all the time. Whereas, especially found in Beijing, which is only very cold half the time, you can notice that your behavior changes a lot between the seasons. Like you walk differently because you don't want to fall over on the ice. All your body motions have to change. So if you're doing a game where people are coming into the cold from the fish out of water, I think it's interesting to force them to do things differently. That's something that's worth bearing in mind.
A third big picture element to my other two of
beauty and survival,
misery and beauty, which is adaptation, adapting to these environments is another big, important concern. So yeah, these are all good general thoughts. In terms of the order I want to take this, I think I want to start with performative stuff. To me, the thing here is quiet. People exposed to these elements in these kind of harsh, severe environments. I know this from a little bit of personal experience, but mostly just from media and things I've consumed. They don't talk much. It's not a chatty sort of thing because the air is so thin. It can even be painful to speak and to take inhalations unnecessarily. So I think that's one aspect of performing an environment like this, making sure your NPCs are curt and always just to the point and all about business. I think that's an important thing. What do you think there?
Yes, with a caveat, though. Yeah, when you're out in the cold, there's no messing around. But a tendency towards trust and helping out is also important. I think we'll come back to that maybe with themes. But generally speaking, I don't think you would have the default, look out, hostile goblin warriors, they're going to fight you, D&D 5th encounter. Generally, if you meet up with someone, might well be in your interest to cooperate. If someone needs a hand across the river, then you give it. So you're right, kind of laconic but helpful, perhaps, is a thing.
Yeah. It's so funny you mentioned that. That actually came up in a game I ran last night, which was also in a frozen environment, but it was a different adventure. But basically, the players encountered this woman by herself, a markswoman. She was injured, and they were kind of being a little skeptical or suspicious of her for whatever reason. And she just said, "So you're telling me you've been out here in this frozen waste for days. I'm the first person you've seen, and you're going to kill me." And they were yeah, that's a good point. That's probably more of a thematic touchstone, I think. But I see what you're saying though from a performative aspect.
Yeah.
Once you do sort of find people, and once you make common cause with people, maybe you do emphasize the need to help each other survive in the way you describe people's sudden closeness or their desire to share their warmth or whatever they have managed to scrounge up. Other performative things, going back to the idea of quiet, and in particular the wilderness here is what I'm speaking of. I really think you want to emphasize, weirdly, the sounds that you do hear, the sounds that interrupt the quiet. I think that's important to emphasize. The crunch of snow under your boots, the single snap of a twig in the distance, the pitter-patter of the first animal you've been aware of for hours, occasional cold howling winds, that sort of thing, right? I think you maybe want to, the way you sort of bring forth the idea of quietness and stillness is the occasional sounds and really emphasizing them in your description.
Yeah, which is one of the things I was thinking about. Maybe is quite similar to that in a way, the idea of having a pattern that's continuing and then things breaking the pattern, because one of the things you can say about a landscape that's blanketed in snow and ice is, I mean, with all due respect to the beautiful vistas of the Great White North, it's kind of the same in many ways. There's a limited colour palette. Yeah, we're not trying to do maybe the realistic Frozen North. We're looking at tales of the Frozen North. And so one of the themes there you get is this idea of it being, it's a slog, right? It's the same thing day after day, tromping along towards your Yukon Gold Rush claim or whatever. I think when you're describing scenes, you do want to try and aim for, and this is the danger zone, right? You want it to be repetitive but not boring. So you've got to start looking at these quite minor variations. So yeah, sometimes maybe just you'll notice the clouds are thinner and higher today than they were yesterday, or there's a slight difference in the wind, or you can see deer in the distance, or these things where it's mainly the same and then a little bit different. Yeah, you've got to be careful because that is borderline boring. So you've got to create that sense of repetition, and then, as we sort of talked about in the Fever Swamp episode, suddenly you'll have a contrast. You come across someone who's built a campfire already, and then you've got this contrast which only emphasizes the coldness and quietness of the surrounding lands.
Yeah, that's great. Shall we move on to mechanical considerations?
Yep.
So in the Fever Swamp episode, we talked about how mechanizing things is one of the best ways to make those things important in a tabletop role-playing game. So if I want to emphasize that the scarcity of fresh water is an important thing about being in a swamp environment, then I have the mechanic that tracks very closely or mechanically how and when you run out of water. By putting mechanics on these sort of environmental elements, you foreground them and you make them important to the players. And this is the unique power of tabletop role-playing games that you can't do in other mediums. So you should definitely try to take advantage of it without it being too, like, you don't want to get bogged down and overhang with rules and stuff, right? But you can just do a few things to sort of really punch up some of these like environmental ideas and make them important to the players. So when you're doing a frozen environment, especially a frozen wasteland kind of environment, this is an important consideration. The game you're playing probably already has special rules for things like movement and how combat is affected by the cold and the snow, but does it have rules for scarcity and hunger? Maybe not. In a lot of games, I'm going to say probably not. Does it have rules for how to handle exposure to the elements? Yes, a lot of games will probably have that, but a lot of games won't. Think about those things and how you can mechanize them. And this is the really key point here. Think about the underlying mechanics, the base mechanics of the system you're using, and how you can make those things, you can tweak them just enough to sort of emphasize and foreground some of the environmental concerns. So in Trophy Gold, I might create a special version of the risk roll that's all about surviving in the harsh environment. In the Black Hack, I might make a mechanic that is connected to resource management, which is an important mechanical part of the Black Hack. I don't have to change much. Maybe just the standard Black Hack rules can be just altered ever so slightly to account for the environment. So your D6 supply becomes a D4 or whatever. My basic point being that you don't have to do a lot here. You can just use what's already there, tweak it for the environment, and get the same effect.
Yeah, I mean, what I think is the current gold standard for rules about being cold in role-playing games is Long Winter by Le Gray. But what's crucial there is he's written a system which is good, but also very simple. So you have one warmth point for being a human who's alive, and you get more by wearing nice, woolly, warm clothing. And I think up to a maximum of 5, whatever. And then the weather will have a cold level, and if it's higher than your warmth, then you start to take damage, basically. And my favourite bit being, of course, if you fall into water, you lose all of your warmth points because you're screwed now. Yeah, like you say, it's something that's very simple, and that you could, you just would write it in the margins of your character sheet, probably, if you're playing an existing game.
Well, and something else you can do that is perhaps more procedural than mechanical, but nevertheless simple and easy to do and achieves the same effect, is the posing and answering of questions. I mean, it's something we've talked about a lot on this show.
Yeah.
It's something I do a lot as part of my personal sort of play culture. I prepare some questions beforehand that help explore these ideas. For example, the characters are running out of rations and they're very hungry, and maybe you ask, tell me about your favorite meal back home. Do you think you'll ever eat it again? Something small has fallen off of you from frostbite. What is it? Tell me something you see that is both lonely and beautiful. Get some of those themes in there. Or maybe, if worst comes to worst, which of your companions would be the best candidate for eating? Those are all things you can throw out there to sort of emphasize the environment, right? And get players really thinking about them.
Yeah, I see you're still kind of skewing towards a certain kind of survival fantasy by the sounds of it.
Well,
This is great to do with your random encounter tables as well, because, quite often in a classic OSR thing, it'll be, if not encountering the creature itself, it's the traces of it. So just ask. You find traces of an owl bear, but how do you know that there's been one here?
Absolutely.
And that makes everyone think about, what does that look like in the snow? Is it different from what it would look like in a muddy verdant forest?
Yeah, I mean, your questions and your adventure, indeed, can be much less survival horror than mine have posited, right? I mean, it can be, like you said, it can be like, I could also see a situation where it's like, maybe you do encounter an NPC who's making a life out in this environment, and you ask something like, what do you see that shows how this person has adapted to this environment?
Yeah.
Just getting the players thinking about the environment is kind of what I'm getting at there,
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, it's just the idea of, if you're taking maybe your standard resolution that you would get from your system or adventure anyway, and if it's now covered in snow, it's important to make everyone think about what that looks like or how that changes to get it across.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on mechanical things?
No, not really. What was the other part you wanted to discuss on frozen settings?
Thematic concerns. Yeah. We've sort of already hit on a lot of that already, because
True.
Listeners, Fear of a Black Dragon loves theme. And this is, all of our conversations are organized around theme, pretty much. Importantly, this is different than like descriptive bits. This is different than set dressing. This is different than the mechanics of surviving. Themes are different. You have some in your notes here, Tom. Like, what are some themes that are particularly important in an environment like this?
Yeah, sure. So, well, the first one I wrote down was quietness. I think we've kind of gone over that a lot. But of course, quietness can mean more than just a lack of physical sound.
Correct.
Your laconic characters are one thing, but also maybe you meet characters who have chosen to not continue communicating in the sense of trafficking with the outside world, that kind of thing, enforced, or chosen isolation.
It could be the quiet of a civilization that used to be in this part of the world that is no longer there. It could be the quiet of a fae spirit that used to rule this land who no longer speaks to the people. Thematically, this is how you get quiet. That's the connection to quietude, right?
Yeah.
Some other things?
Yeah, also, in my notes, I've got freezing. I'm not entirely sure what I mean by this. I think what I mean is this idea of things dying. So things die in winter, they come back in the spring. But in a permanently frozen setting, things kind of die. But also, crucially, I think in our shared imagination, when we think of frozen, we also think of preservation. So,
yes.
the Iceman and so on.
Yep.
So these things die, but they also get preserved. So there's this sort of maybe a sense of loss and also maybe hidden or kept knowledge and this kind of thing. Your ice mummies are probably a great vector for that, for one thing.
Right, absolutely. Ice mummies, the civilization that used to be here, still very intact. Sarcophagi filled with particularly well-preserved corpses. The idea of ancient grudges that have no more practical application to people's lives, but people haven't forgotten them. Like they're still hanging in the air. Yeah. These are good thematic ideas.
Well, of course, of being out of time, isn't it? There's that sort of, I think it's an urban legend, but the idea of some researchers talking to some herders in northern Russia in the 90s saying, what do you think about the Soviet Union, the breakup of the Soviet Union? And they said, what's the Soviet Union? I don't think that actually happened, but it's a good story. But yeah, you're right. There's things being kept past their time. That's a great way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What else do I have? Oh, desolation. So, and in this one, I think the way to, well, we've talked a lot about this kind of in a way already, because talking about supplies and preparation, I think the thematic meaning of desolation in the terms of traveling through a frozen place like this is that, well, yeah, you're alone for a start. You've got no community to help you, maybe. But also, you can't easily replace anything that you've lost, that got broken, or that you didn't bring with you in the first place. If you're adventuring in a jungle and you don't have enough food, you can go and pick some plants or hunt some adults. You can get food. In the frozen wasteland, you absolutely cannot do that. You could play on this quite a bit, actually. And it doesn't need to be through equipment slots and stuff. It could be just by talking about things that you left behind, things you wish you had with you now.
Right.
Or meeting someone like Ben Gunn in Treasure Island. Do you have any cheese? No, I didn't bring any cheese, but that's what he's thinking about because you can't get it. So that's one. And then finally, I want to mention hospitality, which I think is a big theme in cold locations. It's your Sagas of the Icelanders kind of thing.
Right.
Something I found mainly on that trip to Harbin, it was very noticeable. And it's about 20 odd years ago. So maybe it's a hideous cutthroat cyberpunk hellscape now, but at the time at least, because it's so cold and everyone knows that if you get stuck outside or if you start to suffer, you'd want someone to help you. So at one point, me and my friend were walking along the street and it was just getting too cold. We were like, this is too cold. We've got to stop and go inside somewhere. This is stupid. So we went into the first door we saw. It was a bank. And we had no business in there whatsoever. We didn't want to open an account. We had very little money. We were students. But the staff still gave us cups of tea and stuff. And in every shop, every business place, right inside the door, you would see a hot water machine just for people to go in and just stand out of the cold when it's winter. And I'm reliably informed by my friends who lived there, one of whom was born and grew up there, that's pretty much what it's like. You do just let people come into your house, or you do give them a ride if they're kind of shuffling along beside side of the road, freezing to death, because that's what you would want someone to do for you.
Thematically speaking, it sort of gets to this bigger idea about humans as social animals and how we sort of make it. There have been maybe studies or maybe it's just some sort of theorizing I've read somewhere, but we have this idea in post-apocalyptic environments, right? We have this idea that it's just going to be a rat race, a mad dash for whatever resources are left, right? And it's all about me and to hell with you. In fact, though, in circumstances like this, in like for example, like big natural disasters and things like that, people actually come together. We sort of like build community very quickly and figure out how to get along together for mutual survival. A lot of like sort of post-apocalyptic dystopias are maybe not super realistic because they sort of go against like sort of our basic humanity. This is an interesting idea in terms of like this frozen wasteland environment. This is not a apocalyptic moment, necessarily. It's just the environment. But I think you would get a lot of the same sort of thing. Like whatever enclaves of humanity are there are probably going to like instinctively look out for people.
Yeah.
So, what else do we want to say about this?
Actually, I'd like to throw in a couple of minor nuggets of hyper-realism, if that's what you want to do in your frozen setting. If you go to Beijing in the winter, because it has a dry climate, you will notice people touching car doors and other metal objects very gingerly, because there is a ton of static electricity
yes.
in the air. I got electrocuted by the water from my tap, from kissing my fiancée goodbye at the airport. If you wear any kind of synthetic fabrics, not normally a problem in fantasy games, but man, yeah, so static electricity. And also, I think this one might be more practical in a kind of Lord of the Ringsy game. Frozen rivers look majestic and smooth. Let me tell you, they are not. I once had occasion, don't ask me why, to ride in a horse-drawn carriage across a frozen river. Man, it was like, I think it was only about like 50 meters wide, that river. It seemed to go on for hours. It was the bumpiest ride I've ever had in my life. And if you were attempting to flee across one, or perhaps have a battle on one, Alexander Nevsky style, that is a nightmare. I think you could have a half a session trying to get across a freaking frozen river, don't you?
Nice. Let's go to the next segment. It's Companion Adventures. I have a film. Now, here's the thing about my film choice, Tom. I had like 10 other film choices that I wanted to do before this one, but we've talked about them all in other episodes to stand for other concepts and points. So I'm going with The Grey, a classic Liam Neeson action film from 2011 about a group of, I think they're like oil refinery workers or something like that. They get caught in the sort of frozen north, and they are starting to be stalked by this particularly aggressive pack of gray wolves. It's a fun movie. It's a good action movie, but it does a really good job of portraying like this very, like the environment in a harsh way. Like the harsh version of this environment does a good job with that. So I'm going to say The Grey from 2011.
I mean, I don't have any films this time for basically the same reason that you put The Grey. I've fused all of my snowy recommendations. So I instead am going to recommend a video game that I know is available on Xbox One, because that's where I played it, and I assume other platforms too. And that's called Never Alone. And it is a sort of platform game about a young Inuit girl and her Arctic fox that follows her around. That's not the important part. Although, I mean, it's a little platformer that's kind of interesting. But it's also a kind of culture game, and it features educational videos about living in some of the different traditional cultural aspects of the First Nations of Canada, how they lived traditionally and how they live now, and so on. Yeah, it's pretty good. And then it's telling this sort of mythical story about the girl fleeing from a malevolent spirit that wants to kill everybody with the winter and so on. So I'd call it a charming game rather than a very exciting one. But if you can handle that, it's worth a look. And certainly the little documentary segments, I think you can just watch them by themselves. So if you kind of look around on the internet, I'm sure you'll find them.
I'm going to recommend the Dungeon Synth playlist on Spotify, organized by Franz Hollander. You're probably going to run into some problematic folks on this playlist. Just be aware of that. But in general, I think the Dungeon Synth playlist is really, really good. And I like it for Morkborg especially, because Morkborg probably wants to be heavy metal, but I don't like heavy metal music. And so I have to find like the next best thing. And for me, I always kind of like go back to sort of synthwave, to retro wave, to these sorts of types of music. And the Dungeon Synth playlist, lots of the tracks have to do with are inspired by the cold, right? The miserable, lonely cold. And so it's just a good playlist.
Cool. And as mentioned earlier, I think Long Winter has got to be your go-to RPG thing for the winter. So you can get it. It is now available in PDF for the player's book and the GM's book. And so it's kind of an interesting product. It's sort of set in you could sort of wind back the clock to being generic D&D time if you wanted, but it seems to be set roughly in the 1910s in a kind of Middle European Ruritania that is alpine. And the player's book is like a tourist guide to this little Switzerlandish kingdom, and it's all very charming, and you have little missions to do. But then there's sort of a secret thing, which is that a terrible magical winter is coming, and then the whole kind of... Basically, the end of your campaign is going to be fleeing the appalling winter that's sweeping through the kingdom. Yeah. And as I say, it's got these cool systems that are easy to handle for tromping around in the snow and finding trails and encountering things, staying warm, all that kind of stuff. So definitely worth a look. And it's quite adaptable as well. I actually used the winter travel tables from Long Winter when I was doing the travel segment of The Enemy Within that comes near the end of that campaign for Warhammer. So it's not locked into... If you're thinking, I don't want to play a fantasy game that has cars in it, don't worry. You don't need to.
I'm reminded of a real-world survival story game. I think it's by Ben Dutter. And I can't remember the name of it, but that was pretty fun too. And I'd recommend it, but gosh, I can't remember the name. So maybe we'll recall it after the recording.
That's the traditional method, yeah, is we recall it.
Right.
But in the meantime.
And I promise it'll end up in the show notes. I definitely promise that. This is probably not so much a companion adventure, but I do think that you should head over to the Morkborg website and download other free dungeons. Death Ziggurat's totally free, and there are some others on there, and so go check those out.
I would say, have you seen the random dungeon generator on that website?
No, we talked about that. Well, I've seen it. We talked about it once. I remember those. That's pretty cool. I haven't played around with it too much, but good stuff for sure. Yeah. I'm going to recommend my YouTube playthrough of the Death Ziggurat. It's something I'm doing this year. I'm making my YouTube. My online games available to be watched, and so go check it out. It was really, really fun, really, really good. Super creepy session. The horror level was really high in this one, and everybody had a great time. So worth a listen while you're doing dishes or walking the dog, I suppose. Anything else? Or are we good to go?
No, I think we're good to go.
Fabulous. Listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website, gauntlet-rpg.com. We are on Patreon if you'd like to support Fear of a Black Dragon financially. We love that. It's very, very helpful. Go to patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. And thanks, of course, to our elite editor, Rich Rogers.
It's good. Thanks, listeners. Bye.
Bye, listeners.
Hi, this is Lowell, manager for the Gauntlet Gaming Community. I want to tell you that we have a Gauntlet Community Open Gaming event coming up the weekend of February 25th through the 28th. This is a free online RPG mini-con aimed at getting new players acclimated to online play, showing off awesome story, OSR, and indie games, and also introducing folks to how we run games on the Gauntlet. Signups will open February 1st at noon Eastern. Even if an event's filled, we have wait lists, and signing up for those is a good way to show game facilitators what RPGs are in demand. You can find all the details and links at gauntlet-rpg.com/gauntlet-community-open-gaming. There you'll find a link to the online registration calendar. Most sessions run 3 to 4 hours, and we have scheduled breaks between blocks. We're still adding events as of this recording. All sessions follow our Gauntlet Code of Conduct, which includes the mandatory presentation and use of safety tools by game facilitators. We hope you'll check out this community-created event. It's free, and anyone can play. You don't have to be a Patreon supporter or community member. Thanks so much.